Weird.
Recording in progress.
I'm glad that part didn't get recorded.
I didn't know until I read the introduction to this extremely good book you wrote. But he's actually a Southern California kid. Not just that, he's a Beverly Hills kid, for God's sake. His family lived on Rodeo Drive. And so he was surrounded, as he says, by extremely wealthy children of movie moguls or whatever. Indeed, one of his classmates at Beverly Hills High drove to school in his own Ferrari. How's about that? Anyway, what happened was that he was mildly rebellious, as all decent teenagers are. And when President Reagan came in and began talking about the evil empire, Andrew seemed to have thought this was about as far as he could get from Southern California. And so he enrolled in college in Russian literature and Russian politics. And as he says, a long dead discipline called Sovietology. And he was hugely lucky in that his college years, and then some postgrad work he did, and then a year in Leningrad as an exchange student, maybe more than that, coincided with Gorbachev and what amounted to the sort of gradual collapse of the Soviet Union. And so when finally he was looking for employment, he was easy to employ because there had been a large number of academics, certainly in the United States, and I think in most Western countries, who were experts on the Soviets. But down to actually learning about the Russians when he got down to it. And so he was fluent in Russian. And so when he joined the Pentagon in 1990, was it 1991? I can't remember. It coincided, of course, with the end, pretty much the end of the Soviet Union. And so he found himself as one of the few people who actually knew Russia, as well as the Soviet Union, and spoke fluent Russian, called into the most amazing things. He tells a couple of stories, which I won't repeat, but are worth reading. If this was politics and prose, there'd be a stack of books this high for him to sign, but since he's not, you'll just have to go and buy them yourself. So one thing led to another, and as he says, he was in the right place at the right time for someone who actually knew something about Russia and could speak very good Russian. And so that led to a career in, well, certainly better Russian than anybody else except Russian. So what he did was he found himself going to the Pentagon in 1991, then State Department, then White House, and so he's been sort of in and around. It was then think tanks, which has led to ultimately to this, because when we got to know him, we said, "My God, you've got to come and talk and say what you know." Somerset is full of people who know really interesting things, but there isn't anybody else who knows more about Russia than him. So, Andrew, what is yours?
So I am just dazzled by this turnout, and it's so nice to see so many friends and neighbors here tonight. And we just finished, my wife Kate is up front here, but we just got to the 11-year mark of being here in Somerset, and getting to know friends and families in this neighborhood has been so precious to us, particularly our beloved friends, John and Pat Berry, who live next door to Kate's mom, Liza, who's in the yellow house across the street. So anyway, so it's a very Mayberry RFD experience for us all around. And it's been that way pretty much throughout the time we've been here. So I'm going to say a few things to kind of, give you guys my 2 kopecks about Vladimir Putin. And I'm going to circulate a copy of the book just so everyone can sort of look at it if you've never seen a graphic novel or you've never looked at this one. So as I'm talking about this unusual academic book I wrote in this format, you at least get a sense of what I'm talking about. And in an ideal world, I'd put some slides up, and I'm happy to share those with folks if you want to just get a glimpse of the book. But it was a really fun project, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it in a second. So whenever I talk about Russia, and I have a great day job, as John alluded to in his overly generous introduction, I always think about the fact that people in my line of work who are privileged and work in these great august institutions have a lot of explaining to do about how we got so much important stuff so horribly wrong. So just to kind of give you a greatest hits of analytical errors, and I'm saying this as someone who, worked on this subject more or less nonstop for the past 32, 33 years. And then if you date me back to college, nearly 40 years. So here are the sort of reasons why I feel people like me need to demonstrate a lot of humility. So no one predicted that an undistinguished mid-level former intelligence operative named Vladimir Putin would rise to the ranks of the world's great leaders and presumably one of the world's most powerful, richest men. No one anticipated that Russia would make huge gains in its national wealth and its socioeconomic conditions and enjoy a level of prosperity that literally makes this the greatest Russia in the past 1,000 years. No one predicted the 2014 revolution in Ukraine, the Russian illegal seizure of Crimea, and the beginning of a horrible covert war in the southeast of the country. No one predicted in 2015 that Russia would intervene successfully in the Syrian civil war and reestablish itself as a key player in the Middle East, which obviously we can talk about if folks have that on their minds. In 2016, no one predicted that Russia would intervene spectacularly in our politics and help provide some of the impetus for Trump's presidency. And then lastly, if you had been in the room at the White House briefing President Biden and you had said at the beginning of his presidency that there would be a full-scale land war going on in Europe, pitting Russia against Ukraine, you would have been laughed out of the room. So that's a pretty shabby analytical record, I guess, on balance. And so people in my field have a lot of explaining to do. I was very fortunate, and this is probably one of the highlights of my intellectual life, to co-author an analytical memo that started circulating in October of 2021, so about 4 months before the war, written with a colleague and a dear friend, who's a good friend as well, Bob Nurek, who's in the room with us tonight, that sort of explained the strategic calculus for war and why war was coming. And this paper, which circulated in the government before it was published in general distribution, I think really, in many ways, explained the world that we're now in. And that world, I'm going to describe in a few minutes, is it's a pretty ugly story of like Russia's ability to be a very disruptive major challenge for the United States, for our European allies, and most obviously for the people of Ukraine. But at the same time, before I, shower myself in too much acclaim, like I got plenty of things wrong, including what a lot was widely anticipated back at the end of 2021, which is that the Russians would walk all over the Ukrainians, so that this would be a short war and that Russia would dominate Ukraine and the world would have to find a way to kind of punish Russia without allowing us to go back to some form of business as usual. So a lot of us got that wrong as well. So as John alluded to, my background is not the obvious one to put out a graphic novel. And, I did know when I started doing this that I was taking a certain amount of risk, and Kate will, I'm sure, attest to the fact that I was quite nervous about how it was going to be received and whether this would be career harakiri in a certain way, because, I've worked in the serious world and I put out, what some people call a comic book, but more politely is called a graphic novel. I should tell you a little bit about, the fact that I, really didn't anticipate that this book would be so warmly received. But what we've seen is, I had a meeting with someone just the other day about this, is like senior level diplomats, military officers, intelligence officials, and people's grandchildren and children all love this book. And so again, it sort of gets to one of the core motives for doing this, which is the format of graphic novels, if you haven't enjoyed them or looked at them yourselves, really can bring a whole diverse set of audiences to talk about a serious subject. And so I'm not the biggest nerd in the world, but if you do get the bug for graphic novels, there are about 3 or 4 that you might want to start with. The most famous one is called Mouse by Art Spiegelman, which deals with a Holocaust survivor's son's reckoning with his father's experiences in Poland. There's another lovely book called Persepolis, which is about the experience of an Iranian woman during the revolution and sort of how her life was derailed by the Islamic Revolution. There's a wonderful book called Belonging, which was written by a German-American woman about her family's complicity in the Holocaust and sort of reckoning with, the sort of ideas of anti-Semitism that ran rampant in Germany in the 1930s. And then there's a controversial book called Arab of the Future that again sort of looks at sort of the challenges plaguing the Arab world. And again, all these are like serious books. They deal with hard subjects, but they do it in this format that people across generational divides, educational divides, and political divides can all kind of rally around. So there's something magical about them when they work. My background, as John said, is not typical for someone who writes a graphic novel, but I did, in my government career, have this classic career, which I think a lot of people in this room probably did, where I went to meetings for a living, I wrote memos, I got to be in the room. I was very fortunate to be in the room with President Clinton often in the Oval Office and sort of helping manage relations with then President Yeltsin and then his successor, who I got to know in the White House 25 years ago, Vladimir Putin. So I didn't know how to draw, but I was very fortunate when this project started gestating to be teamed up with a very successful graphic artist named Brian Brown, who'd written several best-selling books. He'd never drawn someone's book. And he's a weird guy who really was like the ultimate kind of opposite to me. So the pairing of us and Brian's genius and graphical flair really created this sort of magical book, which I'm still kind of aghast and shocked that I was able to help produce because it's so interesting what Brian brought to it. If I had had my way, it probably would have been a lot more dull. It would have looked like Dick Tracy cartoons or something like that. And when you see what Brian does, it's spectacular. So let me just talk a little bit about, now that I've sold you on the genre of graphic novels, about why I did this. So I started to feel around the time Trump became president that there was a myth-making exercise underway. And that myth-making exercise portrayed Vladimir Putin as this grand strategic genius. And in some ways sort of turned him into a version of Osama bin Laden, who was, America's archenemy and, schooled in the dark arts of the KGB. And that, he had our number and that, he was 10 feet tall. And the image that was, out on cable news and in the public discourse at the time, which, obviously was motivated by the anger about Trump's election in part, and it was hard to kind of explain how that could have possibly happened, really seemed far from the mark about who Vladimir Putin actually is and who he was and what sort of motivated Putin throughout his career. And so I felt like I needed to do some corrective analysis to help people understand that, maybe he wasn't some dyed-in-the-wool hotshot from the KGB who had been, mastering how to undermine the United States his whole life. Maybe he was something else. So I started looking at the role of myths. And what I found, and I just thought was really interesting, and there's a longer conversation we can have about this, is that myth-making and sort of fictitious narrative creation is really sort of cardinal to the way the modern Russian state and the Principality of Muscovy have unfolded over centuries. So Russia didn't really have a clear history. And so as we've all probably read, the Russian leaders, originally the princes in Muscovy, had to come up with an explanation of why their fortunes were rising. And they sort of looked at a successful nearby area where they saw in this nearby area we now call Ukraine, and they sort of came up with a myth that, the cradle of Russian civilization lies in Kyiv, and, we are the inheritors of that. So there's a wonderful book, which I'd recommend all of you, called The Story of Russia by a British historian, Orlando Figes. And it really sort of captures this way that myth-making and lying would be a nice way to put it, sort of lies at the heart of a lot of Russian identity and Russian historiography. But when I was doing this, I also realized that a lot of the lies that we've sort of assimilated about Putin are connected to his rise to power and the need to kind of overcompensate for who Vladimir Putin actually was and kind of portray him to the Russian people as this kind of larger than life action hero. So I thought this was really interesting because, what was that telling us about the actual arc of Vladimir Putin's life, his career path, his formative experiences, and then what do they all have to do with weighty matters like the war in Ukraine? So let's start with his career inside the KGB. Vladimir Putin was never a high flyer. He barely made it to lieutenant colonel. He washed out of the KGB shortly before the collapse of the Soviet Union. So between 1975, when he entered the KGB, in 1985, he had a series of non-consequential assignments working in the HR department, working in what was called counterintelligence and harassing dissidents and sort of ideologically nonconformist people in Leningrad. He was far from the action, Leningrad was not a happening place. It's the second largest city in the Soviet Union, but was definitely a backwater. And none of the things he worked on mattered. And in fact, he made no impression at all on the leadership of the KGB office in Leningrad, which was the biggest after the office in Moscow. And the longtime head of the Leningrad KGB office, a person named Oleg Kalugin, who's our neighbor, who defected to the United States, has this word when asked originally about Putin, like, do you remember this guy? He said, on nikto, he was a nobody. And so that just tells you a little bit about who Vladimir Putin is. He was not someone who was, soaring to new and important career heights. And his only overseas posting, for someone who'd studied German his whole life and who fancied himself a big German expert, began in 1985. And it was in the city of Dresden. So Dresden was a Soviet satellite city, right? It was part of East Germany. And the story that's sort of been lost to history here is that Vladimir Putin really had his eyes set on better assignments. He would have loved to have gone to Bonn, the West German capital, or Berlin. But in the middle of the time that he'd been waiting 10 years to go into this elite training program to prepare him to go overseas, he was in the middle of this course in Moscow, and he went home for the weekend to Leningrad, and someone bugged him on a subway. He got into a street fight on the Soviet metro in Leningrad and broke his arm. And so there's this illustration at the very beginning of the book, it's literally the first scene in the book, of Vladimir Putin chit-chatting with his best friend and saying, yeah, there's going to be some consequences for me losing my temper and getting into a street fight. So that tells you a lot about a person that, having waited his whole life to become a hotshot in the KGB, he couldn't keep his temper and got into a street fight. And so that, can't fully explain it, but seems to account for why he was not sent on a hot, assignment to Bonn or Berlin, but sent to this very sleepy backwater in Dresden. So by comparison, the Soviet Residentura, or headquarters of their intelligence operation in Berlin, had over 1,000 employees. The office in Dresden had 6 people, and they worked in a small villa that was smaller than this town hall. So it was not the place you send a high flyer. And one of the things I found when I was sort of researching Putin stuff after the book came out was a memoir by Putin's beloved German instructor from elementary school. And she had published her memoir about 4 or 5 years after Putin became president. She describes how she took kids on what sounds like the worst school field trip ever. And she was taking them to see a movie in downtown Leningrad. And at some point she came up on a bunch of the kids on the field trip. There was a kid sprawled out on the ground with his leg broken. And so she sort of had to, sort out what kind of fight had happened. And the next day, she went up to Putin, she says, and she asked him to explain his actions. And Putin responded, quote, "There are people who don't understand words or who don't want to understand words. They understand only force." So Vladimir Putin was 14 years old when he said that. Which again, I just think is a very revealing glimpse of who this guy is and what a hothead he is deep down. And you'll see in other parts of the book, I recount my interaction and seeing him as a hothead when he was dealing with then President Clinton. And it was, it was very alarming to us at the time to see how he just couldn't control himself and had this very, very short temper and would act very impetuously, which we took advantage of, to be fair, to throw him off balance. It was no small feat for a kid like Vladimir Putin, who was from the wrong side of the tracks, from a sort of working class family, to get into the best law school in town and then to sort of worm his way into the KGB. So, to give the man credit, he was very disciplined, he was very dogged, he was very dedicated to this goal of becoming a KGB officer. But when I started to look at what the motivations were, and again, this comes back to the theme of myths that runs throughout the book, what really struck me was how much pop culture had infused Putin's ambitions. And so in the mid-1960s, when he was in high school, or when he was Caleb's age, my son Caleb was in the front row, he, like a lot of Soviet youngsters, spent a lot of time reading Pulp Fiction or watching movies and TV shows. And there was a deliberate campaign in the Soviet Union in the 1960s to create this image of dashing, daring do about the KGB and its precursor, the NKVD. And so Putin, from a very early age, kind of fancied himself as a wannabe Soviet James Bond. And there was an actual guy who was one of the most famous character actors in the Soviet era named Vyacheslav Tikhonov, who played leading roles in a lot of these movies and miniseries, TV miniseries about the KGB. And this was someone who Putin just clearly really saw as the kind of person that he would hope to become if he could get into the KGB. In the 1990s, late 1990s, as everyone knows, Soviet Union collapsed. And then there was this long period of disruption. The city where Vladimir Putin worked in Leningrad, then became St. Petersburg, was a hotbed of criminality. And so Vladimir Putin's job in that period was to be deputy mayor in charge of foreign contacts. So there were a lot of foreign businesses that came in, and there was a lot of really dirty business going on. And so at that point, Soviet state had disappeared overnight, and the vacuum was filled largely by criminal organizations. So the government had a titular role in the way how cities like Leningrad were being run, or Petersburg, but the real authority was the mob. And the two essentially fused. And if you want to think about what Russia is today, it's kind of an amalgam of this kind of underground organized crime world and the successor state that replaced the Soviet Union. But Putin had, he was a facilitator. He wasn't like an owner. He wasn't like an operator inside the bureaucracy of the Leningrad mayor's office. But he was an important person to see to get a check off or a sign off on various deals. And was around and definitely connected to a lot of these mobbed up people who dominated the city. And in fact, there was a person who was known as the nighttime governor of the city. And he was the leader of the Tambov crime family, which is one of the biggest criminal organizations at that time in the Soviet Union. So the world he was catapulted through when the mayor of St. Petersburg lost an election was to start taking jobs in Moscow. And the jobs he was given, again, at the beginning, were not real. They were important jobs for how the Kremlin machinery operated, but they were not necessarily the jobs that any of the people in this room would think were the things that would mark you for a rapid rise to the head of state. The first job he had was being in charge of the Kremlin property fund. And so it's sort of like being, I don't know, like what the American equivalent would be. It'd be like GSA or something, which, kind of tracks where all the, Xerox machines are and where all the property, the vast property that the Soviet Communist Party had and then became part of the Russian state. The person he worked for, Boris Yeltsin, was incapacitated by chronic alcoholism and absenteeism. He was a hot mess. And he was also facing a lot of corruption inquiries. And the thing that really endeared Putin to the entourage around Boris Yeltsin, which was led by his daughter, who was then probably the most influential person in Russia, and her then boyfriend, who was Yeltsin's chief of staff, was that at some point, they needed a law enforcement officer to vouch for a videotape. And in this videotape, the chief prosecutor of Russia, who was investigating Boris Yeltsin, was seen in bed with two naked women. And they were not talking about poetry. And Vladimir Putin was asked, as the then head of the security service, is that the chief prosecutor? And Putin sort of dutifully obliged. And this gave the Yeltsin family an impression that this was someone they could count on. This was like a flunky type person, a factotum, who would do their bidding. And so they wanted to find someone who could replace Boris Yeltsin, who would be under their thumb. And they looked back at Putin's history. And one of the things that Vladimir Putin did when he was national security advisor of the country, which is kind of shocking, is he spirited his previous boss, the mayor of Leningrad, St. Petersburg, Anatoly Sobchak, out of the country on a private chartered plane, one step ahead of the law. So he perpetrated a kind of, what would you call that? A flight from justice as a sitting government official. And this really endeared him to the Yeltsin entourage as the kind of person that they thought would be loyal and would sort of stick up for them. And so they came to Vladimir Putin as they were sort of testing out different possible successor scenarios for Boris Yeltsin. They looked back at Soviet iconography, the stuff I mentioned a minute ago. And what they found when they did focus groups was the person who polled the highest when they asked average people what kind of leader you want to see in Russia was this George Clooney figure, this character actor who'd been in all these Soviet pop movies about the KGB. And so they were really surprised. It wasn't Stalin, it wasn't Peter the Great, it was this George Clooney figure. So they immediately set about thinking, well, we need therefore a kind of, former intelligence or police officer type person to replace Boris Yeltsin. And they started testing out various candidates. And there was one big problem with Vladimir Putin, which is he doesn't look like George Clooney. So he's rather small stature, he's rather nebbishy, and he's not glamorous. But they decided that he was the best candidate for the reasons I mentioned a minute ago, in terms of his being so pliable and obedient. And he, when asked, will you take over as Yeltsin's successor, but keep everything in place, keep our role in place, keep all the government in place, allow us to kind of run the country from behind the scenes, Putin said, sure, I'll do that. So they felt pretty confident. And what's remarkable, and again, it's in the book, and I was stunned when I found this, is like years later, the entourage around Yeltsin, including his chief of staff, who was dating Yeltsin's daughter, are freely saying, we really didn't do any due diligence about this guy. We should have talked to him more before we hired him to be the president of Russia. And that, like, we were really bad at vetting him. So they freely admit that he snookered them in terms of making himself out to be meek and, easy to control. But for several years, he did live up to this bargain. And so the Yeltsin family never were prosecuted. They held on to all their ill-gotten gains. And, after about 4 or 5 years, Putin started to unwind that original deal. But when he was catapulted to the presidency, they went overboard in trying to deal with this gap between who Vladimir Putin actually is and the George Clooney guy. And so they dressed him up in military uniforms, they had him fly in jet fighters, they had him talk as a tough guy, and it all was largely an act. And the Russian people, when they saw it on TV, they kind of were in on the joke, they kind of understood that this was sort of Schwarzenegger-ish and that it was kind of, very gauche and very much a put on. But over time, people in the West who didn't really have all those kind of pop culture antenna on never really understood that this wasn't just, a little bit campy. It was to kind of put one over on everyone, that, make Putin out to be something bigger than he actually is. And there's an image in the book of Putin's elevator shoes. I mean, they've really gone all out to kind of try to, make him seem bigger and more of a, person than he actually was at the time. And, for me, sort of, who had a, ringside seat at this time and who was dealing, trying to figure out how to handle our relationship with Putin and how to kind of push him around and how to kind of manage the fact that he was not exactly beloved by all of us in the US government at the time. This is like right at the beginning of his presidency. What was striking was how we sort of missed what I think was sort of the guiding kind of imperative in Putin's mind. And in Russian, there's this word that I think really captures who he is, and the word is государственник, which basically means someone who believes in a strong state. And as I said, the state evaporated at the end of the Soviet era. And he sort of believes that the interests of the state and having a strong state override everything else. It overrides the rule of law, it overrides, everyone's individual rights. And that what Russia needed was to have a kind of strong state put back in place. And he very diligently has done that in spades since he became Russia's leader. What I think was not well understood by me and probably by other people at the time was that the period of the 1990s when all of us were sort of caught up in the euphoria of the end of the Cold War and the rise of a more democratic Russia, that was the anomaly. Like that was the historical outlier, as opposed to the kind of natural culminating end of history thing that everybody in the world would experience if only they were, freed of their governments or allowed to kind of take agency over their destinies. And as I was writing the book, I found this wonderful quote from an eminent Harvard historian who explains about, how encoded this idea of a strong state is in governance of Russia, how deeply entrenched this idea is going back centuries. And it's remarkable to me at the beginning of the Romanov era in the 1500s, when a journey from the Arctic Circle to Moscow would take a year. You needed to go to Moscow to register minor real estate transactions. So just in, in terms of everyone's renovation plans and stuff like that, that was the kind of country Russia was in the 1500s. And I think it just says something that not only was the country that centralized on the sort of registering and administrative side. But it was also very striking that private property was introduced in Russia 500 years after it was introduced in the United Kingdom. So again, the culture that we all sort of think of, rule of law, private property rights, individual liberties, all these things were just very much alien to how Russia existed for the past millennium, essentially. And then there was this brief period in the 1990s when it was all introduced, but it did not set down deep roots. So what I looked at when I thought about, why we got Putin wrong was the sort of destiny of geography and the idea that, if you look at Russia on the map and you look at how Russia's borders shrank so dramatically after 1991 and all these successor states emerged, most, importantly, Ukraine, it really reduced the Russian view of what their strategic depth was. And the idea that had served them so well when they were invaded over the past millennium by the Mongols, by Napoleon, by Hitler, was always that, the way Russia could defend itself would often be to have this big front yard, and they could always retreat deeper into their interior and regather their strength. And the rise of an independent Ukraine really ended much of that sense of kind of margin of safety. And the other thing that was really striking was how Ukraine was the source of all of Putin's deepest failures as president. So Putin came to power in early 2000. In 2004, there was a popular uprising in Ukraine, the Orange Revolution. It was the single biggest black eye of Putin's career, that he had tried in a very overbearing way to kind of manipulate an election in Ukraine in 2004, blew up in his face. We just observed the 20th anniversary of the Orange Revolution this autumn. But there was another event, which was Russia's 9/11, which occurred almost exactly 20 years ago, about 2 weeks ago, where a school was taken over in southern Russia by Islamic militants, and they botched the rescue operation, and hundreds of school children and their teachers were killed. So there's something about these incidents that crystallized in Vladimir Putin's mind the idea that there is a deep conspiracy in the United States government to seek his overthrow, and that the technique the United States has been perfecting all these years is to kind of use our NGOs and the dark arts of the USAID and the State Department to find proxies around the world who will do our bidding, who will be paid by us to overthrow governments we don't like, and that Russia was the biggest, juiciest target. And so in Putin's mind, the terrorist attacks were something that were aided and abetted by the US government. This all happened during the Bush administration. And then the revolution in Ukraine in 2004 was kind of the example par excellence of how this would work. And so for Putin and his inner circle, what they call color revolutions, which are these kind of like street revolutions that end up adopting like a pink flag or an orange flag or whatever it is to kind of rally support, like this is a US created tool to put Russia back in its place and kind of throw Russia back into a period of upheaval like it had in the 1990s. And so if you want to think about like what really motivates Vladimir Putin, it's this combination of things. And so just, I'm conscious of our time, and I want to leave plenty of time for questions. I'm going to try to speed it up a bit. If you think about everything that's gone horribly wrong in 2004, and then went horribly wrong again in Ukraine in 2014, when there was a second street revolution, again caused by Russian meddling and overplaying their hand, he just sees this as a made in the US activity. He doesn't believe that average people have agency or control over their destinies. And a lot of that is just as ludicrous as that sounds to all of us in this room, that people can't, overthrow bad leaders or take, incredible risks and do incredibly brave things to stand up for themselves and their dignity. Putin witnessed this firsthand in that tiny villa in Dresden when the Berlin Wall was falling. And there's this really incredible moment when the German government, East German government is unraveling, where Putin saw on the streets of Dresden the very beginnings of that, like a couple days or weeks before the Berlin Wall fell, he saw kind of mobs attacking the East German cops in downtown Dresden. And it was a very complicated story, which I go into in the book. about why they did this, but it was the first time he saw what would happen if like a Soviet satellite state or a police state pulled back the reins, like all hell would break loose. And so there has been, I mean, for this man, example after example after example, that I think really have etched in his mind a sense that, control, repression, intimidation, like those are the things you need more of. Freedom, being nice, easy to get along with, like those are not the things you need more of. And so when you deal with Vladimir Putin, you're dealing with a person who fundamentally has a lot of deep insecurity and who is really genuinely worried about Russia's strategic position, the fact that it's back to borders that were last seen around the end of World War I, when the Tsarist government abruptly pulled out of World War I and gave up a ton of territory. It's a state that doesn't really believe it has a good handle on its own people. That always feels like it has to kind of overdo it to intimidate average people because they're sort of worried about what they don't know. And that it's just preoccupied with this idea that the United States is behind every bad thing that happens, that we are, sharpening our axes, getting ready to overthrow them. So last thing here, and then I'll conclude, is the war in Ukraine is, obviously been a disaster in terms of what Putin had hoped to achieve. But the longer this goes on, the more Russia's relative advantages come to the fore. We see this in our domestic political debate. You see this really sharp contrast between Trump and Kamala Harris and their desire to, keep support for Ukraine going. You see this in the fact that the political sort of level of attention and interest in Ukraine has ebbed. So Vladimir Putin believes time is on his side and that he can outlast us in Ukraine. He is willing to take punishment. He's willing to take setbacks. We've seen this most recently in this Russian government response to the Ukrainian incursion into Russia itself in the Kursk region. He has not rushed to seize Kursk back. He's perfectly happy to let Kursk burn because he'd rather be slow and methodical than abrupt and stupid. He's clearly betting that Donald Trump will be back in the White House and will kind of pull the rug out from under the Ukrainians. And even if Donald Trump doesn't get back to the White House, he's sort of betting that the political winds in the United States or other countries are going to shift in his favor because we're just going to be tired. We're just not going to want to do this on an open-ended basis. I'm not sure he's wrong about that, unfortunately. I think that's kind of the problem with Vladimir Putin is he's a kind of person who, like, heads I win, tails you lose. And so even if Russia has, suffered more than 100,000 casualties, it's been, humiliated, and the people of Ukraine are now going to be a permanent enemy on his border based on all the war crimes and atrocities that the Russians have committed. So he's created his worst nightmare based on where we started earlier in this conversation about strategic depth and the kind of geographical challenges Russia has just inherently without having natural land borders. It's going to have a country of 40 odd million people armed to the teeth and with a deep grievance for this genocidal war. So, again, where I started was he's no strategic genius, and that's where I'll conclude. Thanks.
I'll take advantage of my seat to ask the first question, which is one reads stories, usually not very well sourced after that, talking about growing Russian discontent. It's suggested that he doesn't want to have proper recruitment of people who might serve in the army, because that would raise more discontent. Do you think any of that discontent is real?
I think that it depends on who you're talking about. If they were drafting people from Chevy Chase or Moscow, there would be a lot of influential people who don't want to see their kids sucked into this pointless war. But life in Russia is cheap, and most people live on very low salaries. And so if they're offered a chance to sign up for a contract as opposed to being drafted, and they're going to make 5 times what they would make in their remote provincial location, plenty of people have taken that deal. So their recruitment efforts are running, I think, above target. They're getting about 20,000 people a month. So they can do pretty well by themselves. And then for those who are in Moscow or glamorous places like that, they leave them alone. So this war is being fought by provincial poor Russians. It's not being fought by the European oriented, affluent, globalized people. And then for anyone who's unhappy, the door's open. You can just go leave. And if you want to try your luck in the West, пожалуйста. And then for anyone who's got the audacity to protest, all they really do is they very selectively punish one or two people to send a message. So Caleb, close your ears. So the example of this that was most vivid to me was when a kid who was Caleb's age was asked to draw a postcard to a soldier at her provincial Russian school. She drew like little flowers that said no war. And they called in her dad and they determined he was a single father, that he may have had some social media activity or something that indicated where she was getting these ideas. So they took his kid away, they put her in foster care, they trumped up charges against the dad for social media activity. I think he got a very stiff sentence, like 6 years in prison. And everyone in Russia knows the story, like that they took away someone's kid because the family had, non-supportive views about the war. They do these things on a really sadistic, very targeted basis. It's not a mass repression at this stage. Sorry,
No dictator governs alone. I mean, one of the things the Soviets tried and succeeded in doing for years and years and years was to keep the Swedes and the Finns out of NATO. Now the Swedes and the Finns are in NATO. They've not only made an enemy, and when he says he's fighting the West, that's right. In fact, we're demonstrating the ineffectiveness of Russia's conventional war machine without losing an American to do it. We can fight for the last Ukrainian and they'll pay the price, both sides. Are there others in Russia who think this is not a good idea? Then do you have any sense how they function vis-a-vis their leader?
It's a good question. So there's sort of two parts. One is coming back to the strategic malpractice of Vladimir Putin's foreign policy. I'll ask you my favorite trivia question, which is how many tanks did the United States have in Europe when the revolution happened in Ukraine in 2014? Zero. So Vladimir Putin has single-handedly reanimated this military alliance that was, the French president said brain dead because it had lost its, strategic reason for existing after the Cold War. So he is now just, again, as you say, brought these things about like Finland or Sweden to a NATO that were completely unimaginable and that are huge strategic setbacks. And, this will be a lasting long-term source of insecurity. The problem with the Russian elite, and there are many, is a combination of conformism, fear, mediocrity, and a real first mover problem. So anyone who has stuck around this long, has enjoyed the benefits of, the good life. I grew up in Beverly Hills, as John mentioned, and the glimpses I've seen of that good life. And I used to work at a hedge fund in New York. They'd make me blush. Like the way that wealth is concentrated in very, very few hands in Russia is on par with what you would imagine. It's the worst of any country, maybe except for a couple of Caribbean islands or a couple of places in sub-Saharan Africa. It's unbelievably, and the level of inequality is staggering. And the government very carefully intimidates people to understand that everything they do is monitored, that there will be a price if you speak out. And I challenge you to find a single Russian government official of any importance who has spoken out. They are all quiet as rabbits. They're all sleeping soundly in their beds, maybe, but they're worried that if one of them does the wrong thing, they're going to pay a price. And you hear stories all the time about random people you've never heard of falling out of windows or being poisoned or whatever. Part of that is just about, as I said, this kind of targeted repression. It's not like those people matter. It's that everyone hears about it And then the more senior people kind of go, got it. You know, I've got kids, I've got grandparents, I've got, you know, reasons not to push my luck.
So,
Yeah, so, since the beginning of this latest Ukraine thing, the US administration has been sort of like holding off on giving Ukraine weapons out of fear that it will provoke Russia and Russia will retaliate against Ukraine, right? And so we give them something, it's good, but not enough. We wring our hands for a while, and then we give them some more, that it's more lethal and longer range. And now, and we've gone through about 4 or 5 stages of that, right? And it's just this ever repeating cycle. So today we're at the stage where it's like, okay, can they get Storm Shadow? Can they? And the recurring narrative is, well, if you do this, Russia could react. So my question for you is, put yourself as like in the White House, and what's your advice to the president about at what point, what's the red line? At what point is Putin going to do something, or should we just give the Ukrainians as much as we can now so that we can keep this thing as short as possible?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, Adam. I think that at the beginning of the war, Joe Biden set some policy parameters that were smart. And one of the foundational policies was this cannot become a direct US-Russia military confrontation. We can help the Ukrainians. There's a lot of help going on sort of backstage that we don't talk about publicly, in addition to the mountains of weapons we give them. But, we want to try to preserve this, distance between ourselves so we're not directly involved in the war in a way that the Russians would see as tantamount to a declaration of war. So I think that's a really smart, sensible thing. And, as you were saying, like, we've invested in our Ukrainian partners and we have not lost a single American citizen to do it, or some American official. No one has been hurt or died, thankfully, in this war. It's tragic how many Ukrainians have died, but, America has really, helped give Putin this enormous black eye. So, I think that is strategically sound. The problem with the way the war gets debated is the Ukrainians just want everything, and they continue to press. And as you say, eventually, their pressure tactics do seem to pay off, and the Biden administration coughs up a weapon system. First it was Patriots, then it was tanks, then it was F-16. So like the things we are doing really, really, really look dramatic.
And every time we hold back, it's like, oh, we can't give it to you because it'll provoke the Russians. We're going to give it to the Russians.
Yeah.
So what would provoke the Russians?
So the key, and there was one incident where this really did look possible. The only likely scenario that I can imagine for Russia to use nuclear weapons is if they are losing, and they are losing badly. And that is the biggest sort of potential red line there is. And there was one incident in the fall of 2022 when the Ukrainians went on the offensive, made these massive gains, caught the Russians by surprise, and put the Russians' most elite unit with its back against the wall at the Dnieper River. And it was that moment when the alarm bells started to ring in the White House, which we've all read about, that Putin is potentially going to use nuclear weapons because he's losing. And the Ukrainians eventually seem to have, either worked something out with the Russians. I don't know exactly what happened, but that Russian group of soldiers magically escaped and crossed the river. So there have been moments when things were really escalating and dire, and we, told the Ukrainians how dire it was, and they seem to have backed off. Right now, Vladimir Putin doesn't think he's losing, right? Vladimir Putin thinks he's winning. And he thinks that if he can use nuclear saber rattling to intimidate us, we will, what did you say, back off and self-deter. And the challenge for any president, whether it's Biden or Harris and potentially Trump, is how do you show resolve without being stupid? And I'm sorry to digress here, but there's a wonderful example of something that happened when Trump was president, doesn't get enough attention, where the US had forces on the ground in Syria in 2018, and a group of Russians attacked a special forces base And they, launched this large attack on our special forces base, and it looked like they were going to wipe out all of our troops. And we called everyone we possibly could on the Russian chain of command and said, if you don't back off, we're going to protect our people. And finally, after the Russians didn't take ownership of this attack, then Secretary of Defense James Mattis under Trump authorized this attack, and we ended up killing hundreds of Russians. And they were sort of unofficial Russians. They weren't, they were these kind of mercenary type, quasi-mercenary people. But it really sent a message to the Russians that really shook them, that like United States means business. And, if you threaten our people, we are going to use deadly force to prevent it. So the problem we want right now is to just not find ourselves in that situation. And that's why, the Ukrainians keep inviting NATO soldiers to come to the country. They want us to, do some of the fighting for them. And I think it's really important that we, move super carefully on those kinds of quests, because you don't want to find yourself back in that situation we were in Syria in 2018.
Ma'am, how do you see what was the United States view of ending this war? Yeah, and that's one question. And then the secondly is that given our physical capacity, can politics aside, will we be able to support the Ukrainian war indefinitely? I mean, what's our horizon?
Yeah, it's a really hard question to answer. So I think it's the question. The Ukrainians are fighting for their existence, right? This is a genocidal war, and they have suffered unspeakable horrors. They've been killed in their bedrooms by marauding groups of Russian soldiers. They've been stuck in concentration camp type conditions and, faced summary executions. I mean, it's all the worst of the worst. Their children have been kidnapped. Their women have been raped. I mean, it's unspeakably horrible. So no one in the West, I think, wants to be seen as shoving Ukraine and saying, you need to end this, or you need to make a deal with this genocidal maniac, Vladimir Putin. And so we're in this really awkward situation where Ukrainians, I think, know that the longer this goes on, it doesn't necessarily get any better for them, that like this, war may be unsustainable for them in terms of the cost for their, their best and their brightest, their young people, their future economic vitality, their ability to rebuild their country, et cetera, et cetera. But they're not going to go talk to Vladimir Putin if they don't feel they're protected against this ever happening again. And because the United States has not, for a bunch of reasons, been able to say, oh yeah, we'll put you in NATO, we'll give you a security guarantee. So don't be afraid to sign a deal with Vladimir Putin, because we will always protect you. And you don't have to worry that, as we did in Afghanistan, we're just going to walk out on you in the middle of the night. We're sort of stuck. And I think the biggest, question for the Harris administration, if they're in, is like, how do you reassess the strategic position we're in, where it looks like it's a war forever, where we're going to have to kind of keep helping the Ukrainians. They're never going to want to deal with Vladimir Putin because they don't trust him, understandably. And we're not really able to give them the security and reassurance that they need to feel that Vladimir Putin's not just going to rearm and do this again in 2 or 3 years after he rebuilds his military. On the question of what's sustainable, I think it is a huge problem, and probably the thing that we should all be the most critical about in terms of the US government response. So just like during COVID, we started this war without the defense industrial base, just as in COVID, we didn't have the ability to make masks and all these other, basic items. In this case, the war is being fought with Korean War era technology predominantly. It's an artillery war. There was one factory in Scranton, Pennsylvania that produced US NATO-sized shells that were being fired at key moments in the first year. The Russians were shooting 20,000 shells a day. The one plant in the US was manufacturing 14,000 a month. So throughout this war, we've just been scrambling to try to rebuild some of the defense capacity to give the Ukrainians stuff they need. We cleared out all of our cupboards, all the inventories for the most part that we were willing to part with, mindful of the fact that the Defense Department has to plan for contingencies in the Middle East and Taiwan, and they can't just give everything away to the Ukrainians. The Europeans have basically given everything away already, so they're cleaned out, and their defense manufacturing capacity is much worse than ours is. And then to add insult to injury, here's where just to tell you how wacky America has become. In this package that Congress took 6 months to approve in the spring, there was money that would essentially provide the last jolt of funding that was required for General Dynamics to open up a new factory in Texas to build this artillery that, Scranton was the main place that was building it. And the congressman for Mesquite, Texas is a MAGA person. So these were jobs in his district and he voted against the bill. So we're just in this upside down world where, if you watch the political rhetoric, I'm trying to be very nonpartisan in my comments, but if you look at the way the Republican Party castigates the Pentagon, they attack defense industry, they have sort of portrayed to their, true believers that America is, run by these no good, bad guys, and Pentagon is too woke, and defense industry or bandits, right? I mean, it's just upside down world. It's completely upside down.
You had to guess, what did Putin say to Trump in that infamous that, where Trump came out looking like he was, Trumpian version of this bombastic self?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big part of the book. And I sort of go through the history of Trump and Putin at length, because I'm sort of pretty OCD about it. The story of like what Vladimir Putin's got on Donald Trump is, great mystery. Like, we just don't know. I think that, Vladimir, the way I would look at it is Donald Trump has always sucked up to dictators. That was part of his business model. And you can just go and see the way he built, casinos or whatever kind of real estate projects he was working on in various parts of the world. It was always part of how he operated. He always thought Russia was like a really promising target for his business activities. And then it sort of lost to history. But during the campaign, the guy didn't think he was ever going to win. He thought it was kind of a way to boost his, his commercial activities. So, Michael Cohen and others were trying to do real estate deals in Moscow during the campaign and baldly lied about it. And so this just created this inherent vulnerability, like leaving aside whatever, yucky stuff, Donald Trump did on his bachelor party nights in Moscow. Which people do in Moscow. Moscow was a very party-hardy place in the 80s and 2000s, and Trump is clearly that kind of person. They lied to the American people about the fact that they were talking to the Kremlin about business deals. So the Russians have, I think, been very good at manipulating the guy, playing to his vanity, and then the reality is that Donald Trump this is true for every foreign leader he dealt with. The Japanese prime minister had him wrapped around his finger, Bibi Netanyahu had him wrapped around his finger. He's just not very good at the mechanics of being president. So it's not singular, I guess, what I'm trying to say. All foreigners have Donald Trump's number.
And there was no transcription, I guess, of that, or no record.
No, there's probably, I'm pretty sure that the White House, has a memcon. I wrote memcons when I was at the White House. They don't include every last utterance, they tend to have an airbrushed. I'm sorry, what's the?
There was that one meeting where they kicked everybody out of the room.
Yeah.
Okay.
But
that's not truly, I'm not trying to carry water for Donald Trump, but, presidents kick staff out of the room. That's something that happens. And so it's weird how, sneaky the Trump people were and how, they were deceitful. And Trump himself is a living, breathing deceit machine. But it's impossible for me to claim that the mystery will be solved. I mean, I think we're all going to be asking ourselves this question for a very long time. Why did Vladimir Putin, manage to, help get this person, destroy America's brand globally? How did this all come about? It did happen, in a similar fashion to the UK. I hate to say it, where, there was a lot of, Russian influence over the Conservative Party in the UK. This is not exactly an unusual playbook. They did it in Ukraine for 25 years. The Russians have, found people. There's a joke in the book, I'll just, which is that the former US ambassador to Saudi Arabia once said, there are two types of, the Saudis believe there are two types of people, Saudis and employees. And, I think the Russians kind of operate the same.
right at the background.
You had said that you think that the possibility that Russia would use nuclear weapons would, or if Ukraine was losing the war. And so what is the end game? Is there an end game that you see, or is this just, as you said, time has to take the course, but what's the end game? And do you think he'd use nuclear weapons without having some kind of tacit approval from China?
Yeah, the end game is not obvious. And I think if, it's possible that, at some point, even a Harris administration would say, like, we just can't sustain this level of economic and political support. Like, right now, the United States and our allies are giving Ukraine $100 billion a year in economic and military. That's just a lot. And the bulk of the military stuff is us. And as I said, our defense industry has not risen to the moment by any stretch. We're really behind the curve on that. So at the same time, what has worked with the Russians is forcing them to do stuff. And like, they're not going to do anything out of the goodness of their heart. So
They're not gonna do anything out of
the goodness of their heart. So like, for example, Ukraine's main economic lifeline, one of its main economic lifelines has been its role as a grain producer. And they were exporting all of their grain through the Black Sea, and the Russians were blocking their ports. So the Ukrainians, who have pretty solid defense capabilities that they make themselves, started sinking Russia's ships. And that persuaded the Russians that maybe they should back off and not antagonize Ukraine in the Black Sea and open the shipping corridor that allows Ukraine to continue to be a grain exporter. So deals like that may be something short of peace that we see emerge, where, for example, there was talk that the Russians and the Ukrainians were negotiating not to hit each other's electrical generation plants. And this is going to be a very hard winter in Ukraine because they've lost half of their electricity generation in the last 3 months or 4 months. So in a country where it's really cold and you need heat and electricity to survive every winter, the Ukrainians are now hitting various critical infrastructure around Russia. And this is all part of an effort to kind of bring the Russians to the table and, agree not to hit Ukrainian critical infrastructure. Like those kinds of things to me seem more likely to be the end game.
Does it seem likely that, because apparently this is the decision that's on the table right now, whether to, as the gentleman said, to let sell weapons that will go in, that could hit Russian cities and Russian, what do you do? Just hit close-in ones or ones that aren't too,
Yeah.
isn't that like what they're weighing at this instant, Biden is weighing?
I think the Ukrainians have tons of capability to do that stuff themselves, and that we could help them do more of it themselves without putting our fingerprints all over it.
Yes, you can.
No, we just need to give them the money and, help them build this stuff. And like, we could make that happen if we had more unity of purpose. The problem for the Ukrainians is just like, how are you going to occupy Russia? How are you going to bring this country to its knees? Like, it's not obvious, right? It's a really tough challenge that, has, all sorts, throughout history been in the category of too hard. So on the Ukrainian side is like, let's be audacious, let's be unpredictable, let's do things that look crazy, right? And they're very good at that because they really know the Russians better than we do. And I think they have a better capacity for getting under the Russian skin. On the China piece, just to come back to that, like, I don't think the Chinese have any great love for Vladimir Putin.
Yeah.
They don't have any great love for this war, but they're really mad at us for the most part. I'm not an expert on China. And so if this is keeping us tied down and distracted, that's good for them. And they're pretty much they're respecting the red lines that the Biden administration set, which is don't send weapons directly to Ukraine, to Russia. And they've respected that for the most part. They're doing everything else possible. And then they're benefiting because the Russians are giving them advanced technology that they previously would have been very reticent to provide. And they get to be, this kind of burr in our saddle.
The Russians are giving the Chinese.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, they're helping, China with nuclear and military modernization things. that they've wanted for ages. There's not that much technology Russia has left that China doesn't already have, but they're kind of cleaning out what's left.
Okay, last question. please.
And I'm happy to stick
Madam.
around if people want to chat.
Okay.
Yeah.
So a question and a comment. One is that war changes over time and the narratives of war change over time. How much of this war is still about Ukraine? Right? I'm thinking about China, I'm thinking about North Korea, I'm thinking about what may not be happening in Sudan. And what is your view on that shift in the narrative and how much attention are we paying to it, should we be paying to it? And the second is you started off by listing off things you miss. Right now, and this is not a fair point, but right now, what do you think you're missing?
No, it's a great question. It's a great question. We all felt a connection to the people of Ukraine at the beginning of the war. I think there's no doubt that that was partly driven by the fact that they look like us, right? And the Ukrainians did a very good job of kind of creating a sort of, public outpouring of support for them as, people who were the victims of unprovoked aggression. And so, hats off to them for motivating this much popular support. And we saw flags and all these other manifestations of Western support for Ukraine. The problem with that is my former boss, the CIA director, Bill Burns, says this all the time, like Americans have ADHD and like, we just don't, or I'm sorry, ADD, we have attention deficit disorder. And like, we just don't stick with something very long. So we're now 2.5 years, almost 3 years into this. And Ukraine is not on the front page, right? And it's tragic. I think in Gaza, we're probably also getting into the same situation where, the war in the Middle East is not a burning concern, right? It's our campaign. So I think that unfortunately is a reflection of our, media culture and the way people just don't pay attention to anything for very long. As far as things I'm missing, the information sources from Russia have really dried up. They're not totally gone, but there's no Westerners there. There's no media presence. I think we are operating in a very unfavorable long-term position as a government. Western governments are operating, not we, but Western governments are in a very poor position because no one will talk to them anymore, and they're just essentially prisoners of their embassy compounds. It will be a long time before anybody, like maybe I'll tell you a story. A friend of mine who's a European ambassador here saw the Russian ambassador recently and asked him whether his kid, who's Caleb's age, will ever go to Moscow. And my friend, the European, said, I think he will. And the Russian ambassador said, you're an optimist.
You're what?
You're an optimist. So this is a structural long-term problem, and I don't think it's a problem that we can't deal with. I think the Cold War was far worse. The Soviet Union was far scarier. But we're dealing with a rogue Russia now. We're dealing with a country that's conducting sabotage attacks and tried to kill people in a provincial British town, with a nerve agent. Like, these are not normal actions of a normal country. These are, this is something else. And we don't want to get into war with them. So our ability to force them to stop is inherently circumscribed. And it's going to require a lot of resolve, a lot of care, and a lot of careful use of leverage. And the last thing I'll say, like, whenever I just think about our foreign policies, we spend a lot of time beating our chest. We spend a lot of time decrying, a lot of time wagging our finger, and Americans are pretty overbearing in the way we conduct our foreign policy. But leverage is where it's at. And Russians understand leverage, and we don't always understand it that well. So like the example I gave you about Syria, like that's how you get the Russians to do things. What the Ukrainians are doing, that's how you get the Russians to do.
Thank you.
Right.